Nutty Putty Cave, Upside Down, Death Trap. On November 24th, 2009, the day before Thanksgiving, a 26-year-old medical student named John Jones arrived at Nutty Putty Cave in Utah with his younger brother Josh and 9 friends. John was a husband, a father to a 13-month-old daughter named Lizzie, and his wife Emily was expecting their second child. He had grown up exploring caves with his family all over Utah, and Nutty Putty was a place he had heard about for years. The cave had been discovered in 1960 and was famous for its incredibly tight passageways with names like the Birth Canal, the Scout Eater, and the Aorta Crawl. It had been temporarily closed in 2006 after multiple rescues of trapped visitors, but it had reopened just 6 months earlier with a new reservation system. John and his group entered the cave around 8 o'clock in the evening and spent the first hour exploring a large room called the Big Slide. Then John, Josh, and 2 friends decided to find the Birth Canal, a tight but navigable passage with a turnaround point at the end. John went first, crawling headfirst through a waist-high opening and squeezing deeper into the rock. But he had taken a wrong turn. Instead of the Birth Canal, he had entered an unmapped section near an area known as Ed's Push. The passage narrowed sharply and then dropped into a vertical fissure, barely 10 inches wide and 18 inches high. Thinking he had found the turnaround, John pushed himself headfirst into the gap. In an instant, he was stuck, wedged upside down at a 70-degree angle deep inside a crack in the earth with no room to move. His arms were pinned, his chest was compressed, and all the blood in his body began pooling in his head. Josh found his brother's feet sticking out of the fissure and grabbed his ankles, pulling as hard as he could. John did not move. Josh's hands began to shake as the reality hit him. His brother was trapped in a position that no human could survive for long. Rescue teams arrived within hours and began working in the tight passage to free John. They set up a sophisticated system of ropes, pulleys, and bolts drilled into the cave walls. But only one person at a time could fit close enough to reach John, making the rescue agonizingly slow. After hours of work, the pulley system was finally engaged, and an 8-man team began pulling in unison. Inch by inch, John rose higher, and for the first time in hours, he made eye contact with the rescuer closest to him. He looked exhausted, his face was red and dirty, but he managed a small smile. Then, on the next pull, something catastrophic happened. One of the anchoring bolts ripped out of the cave wall. The entire system failed, and John plunged back down into the fissure, deeper than before. The impact was devastating. John's spirit broke along with the equipment. He began drifting in and out of consciousness, and at one point told rescuers he could see angels and demons around him. The last person to reach John found him barely conscious, his body shutting down after 27 hours trapped upside down. At 11:56 on the night of November 25th, 2009, John Edward Jones was pronounced dead from cardiac arrest. Rescue officials determined it was too dangerous to attempt to recover his body from the narrow fissure. John's family agreed, and on December 9th, 2009, authorities used explosives to collapse the passage around his body. Every entrance to Nutty Putty Cave was then filled with concrete and sealed permanently. John Jones was the first and last person to die in Nutty Putty Cave, and the cave itself died with him. Sand Cave Trapped Explorer Tragedy. On January 30th, 1925, a cave explorer named Floyd Collins crawled into a narrow cave called Sand Cave in rural Kentucky. Floyd was 37 years old and had been exploring caves since he was 6, searching for underground wonders he could open to paying tourists. In those days, landowners around the Mammoth Cave area competed fiercely with each other to attract visitors, a period known as the Kentucky Cave Wars. Floyd had already discovered Great Crystal Cave on his family's farm, but it was too far from the main road to draw enough customers. So he made a deal with a neighbor to explore Sand Cave, which sat right beside the busy Cave City Road. Floyd entered alone, carrying nothing but a single kerosene lantern, and began squeezing through passages so tight he had to crawl on his stomach with one arm stretched out ahead. He pushed deeper and deeper, excited by what the cave might hold. But as he turned to make his way back out, his foot knocked loose a 27-pound rock that fell and pinned his ankle inside the narrow crawlway. He was trapped just 55 feet below the surface, wedged in a space barely wider than his own body. Floyd screamed for help, but it was hours before anyone realized he had not come home. The next day, neighbors found his coat hanging outside the cave entrance and sent a 17-year-old boy crawling back through the tunnel to find him. The boy reached Floyd and confirmed the terrible news. He was alive but completely stuck. Word spread fast, and within days, what started as a local rescue became a national sensation. Reporters from across America descended on the tiny Kentucky community, and radio stations broadcast updates to millions of listeners. A young newspaper reporter named William Burke Miller was small enough to crawl into the passage and actually interview Floyd underground. Miller brought him food and water and later won a Pulitzer Prize for his coverage of the rescue. For 4 days, rescuers were able to reach Floyd and keep him alive with supplies passed through the narrow tunnel. But on the 5th day, a section of the passage collapsed, sealing off the only route to reach him. From that moment on, no one could get to Floyd. They could only hear his voice echoing faintly through the rocks. Engineers and miners were brought in to dig a rescue shaft straight down from the surface. Above ground, the scene turned into a circus. An estimated 10,000 people gathered at the site on a single Sunday, and vendors sold food and drinks to the crowds. The day became known as Carnival Sunday, and it remains one of the strangest spectacles in American history. Below the surface, Floyd Collins lay alone in the freezing, cold darkness, slowly dying of thirst, hunger, and hypothermia. Day after day, the rescue shaft inched closer, but Floyd's voice grew weaker until it finally went silent. On February 16, 1925, after 17 days of digging, rescuers finally broke through to Floyd's position. They found him dead, his body still pinned by the rock that had trapped him, his ankle still locked in the same position. He had likely died around the 13th of February, 3 full days before they reached him. Peak Cavern Wedged student death. On March 22, 1959, a 20-year-old university student named Neil Moss entered one of England's most famous caves with a group of fellow explorers. The cave was Peak Cavern, a vast underground system hidden beneath the village of Castleton in Derbyshire. Neil was a first-year philosophy student at Oxford University's Balliol College and a keen member of the University Caving Club. He was tall, slim, and athletic, exactly the kind of young man drawn to the thrill of squeezing through places no one had been before. On that Sunday afternoon, Neil and 7 others from the British Speleological Association set out to explore a narrow shaft that had been discovered just 2 weeks earlier. The shaft was located inside a chamber called Stalagmite Chamber, roughly 1,000 feet from the cave entrance. It was a vertical drop, about 40 feet deep, with a dangerous corkscrew twist in the middle, and walls barely 2.5 feet wide at the narrowest point. Neil volunteered to be the first one down. He lowered himself using a rope ladder, squeezing past jagged rock as the shaft tightened around him. About halfway down, he encountered a boulder blocking his path and tried to push it out of the way. The boulder shifted, but instead of clearing his route, it jammed the rope ladder beneath him and sent loose debris tumbling down around his body. Neil was now wedged tightly by his shoulders and helmet in the narrowest section of the corkscrew. He could not bend his legs to push himself up, and he could not flex his elbows to pull himself higher. He shouted up to his friends, I'm stuck! I can't budge an inch!" His companions immediately tried to haul him out using a handline, but the rope was not strong enough and snapped 3 separate times. Each failed attempt seemed to wedge Neil deeper into the rock. As the hours passed, a new and invisible danger began closing in. Carbon dioxide from Neil's own breathing and his carbide lamp was building up in the base of the narrow shaft. With nowhere for the gas to escape, the air around him was slowly becoming poisonous. Neil began to lose consciousness, drifting in and out of awareness as the CO2 levels climbed. Word of the emergency spread, and over 200 rescuers descended on Peak Cavern. Cavers, RAF personnel, and volunteers from across the country. An 18-year-old woman named June Bailey, one of the smallest experienced cavers in northern England, spent 6 hours trying to reach Neil but was driven back by the foul air. Veteran caver Bob Leakey also tried but could not get close enough to help. An RAF doctor named Flight Lieutenant John Carter spent 14 straight hours underground working to save Neil's life. But by the time a stronger rope arrived, Neil was unconscious and could no longer tie it around himself. No one could reach far enough into the shaft to secure him. On the morning of March 24, 1959, after 35 hours of being trapped, Neil Moss was declared dead Bushman's Hole, Deep Dive Recovery Death. On January 8, 2005, world-class diver Dave Shaw prepared for an extremely dangerous mission. He was at Bushman's Hole, a deep underwater cave in South Africa. 10 years earlier, another diver named Dion Dreyer had died in the same cave. Dion Dreyer's body had sunk to the bottom at 886 feet deep. At 886 feet, the water pressure is crushing and deadly. Very few divers in the world have the skills to reach such extreme depths. Dave Shaw was one of the most experienced technical divers alive. He had successfully completed many deep dives that other divers considered impossible. Shaw decided he would try to recover Dion Dreyer's body and bring it to the surface. He wanted to give Dion's family closure after 10 years of waiting. Shaw knew this would be the most dangerous dive of his entire career. He attached a small camera to his diving helmet to record the recovery. The camera would document every moment of the dive for safety and training purposes. Shaw entered the water and began his descent into Bushman's Hole. The deeper he went, the darker and colder the water became. At extreme depth, every movement must be slow and careful. After many minutes of descending, Shaw reached the bottom at 886 feet. His helmet camera recorded him finding Dion Dreyer's body in the darkness. Shaw began working to secure the body so he could bring it up. As he worked, something went terribly wrong. Shaw became entangled in a nylon line attached to the body. The line wrapped around his equipment and body in the freezing water. He tried to free himself, but the entanglement only got worse. The footage from his helmet camera shows his breathing becoming faster and faster. At extreme depth, breathing too rapidly causes carbon dioxide to build up in the blood. Carbon dioxide buildup makes a diver confused, panicked, and unable to think clearly. Shaw's breathing continued to accelerate as the CO2 poisoning took hold. The camera recorded 17 minutes of his struggle in total darkness. His movements became slower and less coordinated as the poison affected his brain. Eventually, Dave Shaw lost consciousness from the carbon dioxide buildup. He passed out while still entangled 886 feet below the surface. Dave Shaw never regained consciousness and died in Bushman's Hole. His body sank back to the bottom along with Dion Dreyer's remains.